Hello, I'm Chuck Martin, and welcome to the Voices of the Internet of Things. With me today is Robert Policano, Product Manager at the Drag and Drive Innovation Showcase at Nuance Communications. Robert has held several positions at Mercedes Benz USA, including Market Director, Product Manager of Service Contracts, and Product Manager of Telematics, as well as Global Strategy and Planning at Daimler. At Nuance, Robert's focus is on developing the vision and innovations for Nuance Automotive's Drag and Drive portfolio. Welcome here, Robert.
Thank you, Chuck.
So you've been in this business for a long time, like a couple decades. Tell me what it's been like. You've also been involved in innovation for a long time. So I wonder if you could just take me through the kind of the roadmap of what you've been seeing.
Oh, yeah. Well, the automotive space has really held my attention for pretty much the majority of my career because it's an area that's constantly reinventing itself and changing with the times and innovation. And there's just like endless opportunities to really be on the cutting edge of what's happening in the world today when you're in automotive.
So if you look back when you were at the beginning of your career at Daimler and Mercedes, did you expect would be where we are today?
Oh, God, I don't think anybody could have anticipated where we'd be 20, 25 years later. I mean, back then we were focusing more on, the driving experience more from, handling. And there was the technology that we talk about in cars in those days really related more to suspension systems and steering and how quiet the car was. It really didn't focus as much as, the extent of electronics that we had in cars back in the 90s was really about the radio. And if you had a CD player in your dash, that was considered pretty cutting edge.
So has the car industry become a software industry?
You could really look at it that way. When you think about all the electronic control modules that are in the modern car today, in some, they number in the hundreds, quite literally, the processing power. And what they all do, it's without software, I don't think we would have cars at all the way we understand them to be today.
So is the lead time still like it used to be for developing cars where it's really years out?
Well, that's been a big challenge and a conundrum for the industry for quite some time at this point, particularly over the last, I would say, dozen years, because, car life cycles are always measured in years, and generally, the typical car platform takes anywhere from 5 to 7 years to develop. And by the time that 5 to 7 year cycle ends and the car goes on sale in the dealership, the electronics in it could very well be out of date and behind the times. So the conundrum has been sort of how do you, preserve that product and let it evolve after it's sort of left the showroom. And so I think we're seeing more of a decoupling of, the electronics and the software in the car from the actual physical components of the car themselves. So, with the advent of things like the internet and being connected and, the opportunities that creates, such as, remote over-the-air updates and pushing new features to the car. These are all things that were many, many years in the planning. And, in the early days, there really weren't even great, reliable, secure methods for doing that. And today we're starting to see these and they're becoming the norm.
So how do traditional car companies keep up with the Tesla type car companies these days? Because the scale is totally different.
Yeah, well, Tesla, the way I see it, had, in a sense, an advantage that they had a vision right from the beginning. They didn't really have that legacy of years and years, decades of infrastructure and processes that they had to sort of refine and adjust in order to be as nimble as they have been able to be and the forefront of innovation. So they were started basically with a clean sheet of paper and a very grand vision from, their founder, obviously. They shook things up, and I see it as, really inspiring because it's really their success has really awakened the larger traditional, automotive industry. And, there's a lot to be learned from sort of their more agile approach to development.
So should the traditional car companies have started their own Tesla type company or just try to evolve or revolutionize their current business?
Well, I think these things, revolutions in the car business, I don't think are going to be as dramatic or as quick as people might imagine. I just think it's like turning a battleship. It takes some time. It's not a speedboat, right? To use sort of a boat analogy here. I don't think they need to completely change everything that they do because, quite frankly, all these new technologies that we in the industry are so focused on and that the media is reporting upon and that is getting a lot of the attention, they still represent a relatively small yet growing at a steady pace. But the majority of vehicles today are still the traditional internal combustion engines, large trucks. And it's going to take quite some time for us to move towards, a fully electric, and everybody's talking nowadays about semi-autonomous and fully autonomous vehicles, which I have no doubt, and I don't think anybody at this point in the industry has any doubt, are in our future. There's a lot of debate in terms of when that'll really happen, but really I'd say, over the next 10 to 20 years, that will become much more commonplace. So we have time to reinvent and adjust as an industry. There's a lot of learning that has to happen along the way.
So at CES a year ago, all the talk was, or the buzz was, self-driving cars. Everyone was going insane about self-driving cars. At this past CES, and when you and I met at the Nuance booth, the discussion now is enhancing the driver experience as opposed to replacing the driver. Is that something that you're seeing in the industry as well?
Yeah, it's kind of funny how our industry is. It's and just electronics and technology in general. There's always these big themes that seem to emerge where everybody seems to be talking from the same script, right? User experience is definitely one of those, as you just mentioned. And I think it's come really from the realization that, in order to become, that fully autonomous vehicles are still many years away. We have the key components in the technology, but there's a lot of infrastructure, there's policies, there's standards, there's any number of things that need to really huge investments, before we really get to a point where they're, mature. So we're still very much in the early days now. But people are starting to realize, well, what does that really mean for the customer and, our way of life? How is it really going to change the world as we know it? And so now all of a sudden people are starting to ponder those questions and saying, okay, well, what's the user experience? I mean, I guess that's what we call it, but really it's, what are those implications? And so what you're seeing and what we saw at CES this year is a lot of different manufacturers and players in the ecosystem, coming up with their thoughts and their visions and their ideas for what those experiences are going to look like and, what the foundational technologies are going to be to create them.
So what does the ecosystem of automotive look like these days? I mean, we're seeing a lot of partnerships that we never would have dreamed of many years ago.
Yeah, well, I think, it's not just about building metal, putting wheels and motors together. There's, you mentioned at the top of the call here that these are becoming like software-driven technologies. I mean, for years I've been using the expression, and I can't say that I coined it because I've heard others use it too, but, the automobile is the ultimate mobile device. There are just so many different aspects of that no one single entity is really capable of developing, all the various solutions and then integrating all of those solutions perfectly. So really in some ways, I think the role of the manufacturer is finding the right partners, suppliers, tier ones, tier twos, that they can then sort of almost like the conductor of an orchestra bring together in a symphonic way to create the experience that they're trying to in their cars. And, in Nuance Automotive, we see ourselves as one of those key players there. We've been working with manufacturers for over a decade now. There are over 250 million cars on the roads today across the globe that have some Nuance technology in them. And so we really understand the processes there, and the value that we're creating here is that we really believe in, and in some ways are uniquely positioned, is that speech is going to continue to, it will only become one of the most critical interaction methods that people will have with machines in general, but specifically in automobiles. I almost see it as sort of the hub, of all the various different ways that you will interact with the technology in your cars, whether it's through touch or head tracking, eye tracking, haptics, handwriting recognition, gaze, so on and so forth. There's many ways, but they're all sort of united through speech.
So Nuance is obviously known from way back when from Dragon Dictation, but it's not necessarily known for having all this connection in cars. Do people know about that?
We're trying to get the word out. I mean, we've been doing a lot of what we're now referring to as multimodal interactions with the assistant. So we think really, the way we kind of think of it is that, speech alone is not going to create the user experience that we're going to need for vehicles of the future. It's going to be a critical, necessary component of that. But for a mobility assistant or an automotive assistant to really do its job well, it's going to have to not only interact with all the various sensors and technologies and interfaces that are in that vehicle, but be able to leverage information about the environment that the car is driving through, use information about the user that it learns over time or that it's told by the user, and communicate with the outside world to bring relevant data and content into that experience there. So it's necessary to be a player or to be thinking. I'm speaking from a Nuance perspective here. How can we reunite and unify in a seamless way all of those different modalities and attributes, wrapped in speech primarily, but to create that end-to-end experience that is really going to be required.
So the Super Bowl ad for Mercedes, was that your audio in that car?
Yeah. So what that ad was highlighting was talking to the car, basically. And so with their latest generation infotainment system that they've dubbed MBUX, you can speak in natural language to the vehicle, first by using what we call a wake-up word. In their case, it's "Hey Mercedes." In our demos, you probably remember we were saying "Hello Dragon" very often. Or we also, not to segue too hard here, but we were also demonstrating our Just Talk technology, where you don't need to press a button or use a wake-up word, and it's just always listening to you and listening for how it can help. But the Mercedes system does use the "Hey Mercedes" wake-up word, and you could ask it all sorts of things about the car and the entertainment system in the car.
So from a branding standpoint, I know you've been involved in marketing and branding in your career. How does Nuance get a play in that? Because the consumer buys, they buy a Mercedes. They don't say, "I want a car that has the Nuance speech system."
Yeah, and that's fine. We're comfortable with that because we've always been and intend to stay a B2B. We're a brand inside. We're a tier one supplier in many cases to manufacturers. In other cases, we work with their tier ones, but we've become a tier one in many cases, including Daimler. And, from the end user perspective, we don't think it's really important for them to know that Nuance is inside. It's more important for our industry and the people who are, planning their products, their brands, to know what we're doing. Yeah, it's interesting because, just speaking more broadly, consumers, people just like you and I, are interacting with Nuance technology some of us literally on a daily basis, and we don't realize it because Nuance, the company, has multiple divisions: enterprise, healthcare, mobility, and so on, and our technology using, for example, voice biometrics or natural language understanding, it really shows up in a lot of different industries. So when you call your utility and they ask you to create a voice print to identify you the next time you call, chances are that's probably Nuance inside. Or when you're talking to your car and asking it to change the radio station, that's Nuance. But the end consumer doesn't know that because we're a business-to-business organization. And automotive manufacturers, we offer in the automotive division so many different technologies, platforms, and applications that, combining them in different ways and always improving them or introducing new technologies, the manufacturer can really create different types of experiences. And so it's more important for us to be supporting the vision that car manufacturers have for the user experience that they want to create, and have that be recognized by the consumer as like, I want that Mercedes experience, or I want that BMW or that Ford experience. And that's a space that we're comfortable being in.
So how do you get into things like someone's driving and they look at a building and say, what's that building? I mean, because that's not voice, really. It's more than voice.
Well, it's more than voice, but voice is an aspect of it, right? So, imagine, and this is tying into sort of that multimodal topic that we were just on a few minutes ago here. Car companies are experimenting and starting to introduce a lot of new sensors and capabilities in their cars, cameras, radar, sonar, for various applications. And, in the shorter term, I would say for the next 10, 15 years, when you think about, that sort of interim period before we reach full autonomy, we're going to have a lot of the components starting to emerge in the car, but we still want to keep the user entertained. We want to keep them ultimately very safe and productive. And if there's going to be a camera in the car, for instance, and it can track where I'm looking, as we were demonstrating is possible at CES, to be able to be, driving along and something catches your eye and to say, hey, what's the name of that? What is that building? Or what's the name of that bridge? Like we were demonstrating driving through Lower Manhattan there, and there's many bridges, and not everybody knows the difference between, believe it or not, the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan Bridge. But, to be able to be looking at it without taking your eyes really off of where you're looking on the horizon and just asking what's the name of that bridge and have it to respond to you and know what you're looking at is it's pretty cool. And it's very natural too, right? Because that's speaking to the car is becoming much more like speaking to another person. And this is something that we often use the word of, because we can't think of a better way of describing what we're aiming for, but we're trying to humanize that interaction between car and user. And part of that is, not having to necessarily use a wake-up word, for example. Part of that is to have it know where I'm looking or what I'm pointing toward or gesturing at, and responding appropriately to a command. And it's also using more natural language, advanced natural language capabilities, such as emoting or matching my mood or adjusting its way of speaking with me based upon the conditions. Let's say I'm in a lot of traffic and the sensors in the car detect that I have what we scientifically would refer to as a high cognitive load situation. In other words, we're stressed and we're trying to focus, but yet we need some assistance. The assistant can adapt to that and be a lot more succinct and short and just provide the most relevant information at the most relevant times. Whereas if it detects that I'm in a much more relaxed situation and perhaps maybe in the mood to have a little bit more interaction with the system, it can adapt itself and become more verbose and, or chatty. And this is all part of a new growing topic that's really starting, that we're talking a lot about but it's something that a lot of manufacturers are also starting to talk about, and this is emotion AI. So giving some sort of cognitive recognition capabilities to the system.
So over time, will all manufacturers, since everyone can see what everyone else is doing, will all cars have sort of the same functions or features?
I don't know. That's a good question. I think there's many different ways that these can be combined and implemented. And, a really well-designed mobility assistant is going to have its own unique personality. Personality and, feel to it. So I don't know. That's kind of a hard question to answer, but I do think as that's something that everybody's looking at as a way to differentiate their brand. So, I mean, we used to, we were talking at the top of the call about, some of the things that I've seen in my career in automotive, and 25 years ago, how we differentiate one of the big ways that we would talk about differentiating ourselves was on quality and reliability. Don't worry about the car breaking down, or when it does, you'll be taken care of, more effectively than maybe our competitor might take care of you. And, in that time, the quality of cars and manufacturing has just improved so much that it's hard to really sort of differentiate one brand from the other just based upon the mechanical reliability or quality. There's a lot of great cars at every price point now. So, how do you really stand out and differentiate yourself? And it's really how you implement these advanced technologies. And I really think that mobility assistants are going to become very commonplace in all aspects of our lives. We'll be talking to ATMs, if we even need ATMs in the future. Quite frankly, we'll probably go very walletless and cashless at some point. But we'll be talking a lot more to technology, and whether we're in our own private vehicles or in a shared vehicle or some other mode of transportation, these machines are going to have and emote some sort of personality for us to trust them and to differentiate one from the other. And I think, that's one of the goals. So, I mean, in short, to answer your question, I think they're going to be implemented across the board, but probably in very different ways that we haven't even imagined yet.
So earlier you mentioned the auto becoming basically the center of mobility. What's the role over time of the smartphone? Right now, a lot of smartphones are the connection from the car. Does that ultimately go away?
I don't know if it ultimately goes away. I mean, it could evolve to the point where I think my guess is that there's going to be our mobile phones are like extensions of ourselves. I always think of my phone in some ways as my brain or my memory, because I keep so much information in there that I just can't hold on to into my head, and it is like an extension of me. And I think you could also see our mobile devices that we're bringing into the car sort of introducing us to that vehicle in the sense that, let's say maybe we have a stored profile on our phone that can then communicate with the car, whether it's a particular type of car or a line of cars from a particular brand, or maybe any car. And that might be there might be a handshake, if you will, or a pairing between that device, between devices. So that could be a role that smartphones play. But it's hard to say. I don't know. I mean, I haven't really thought so much about the phone and where that's going, because it's kind of a secondary point to some of the topics that we're really focused on at Nuance. But I kind of could see a day where we don't even really need phones anymore, because everything's going to be so connected. And I think even a company like Nuance is going to be at the center of some of these capabilities of being able to communicate with all sorts of machines around us. Whether you're just going up to the subway and buying a ticket, who needs a wallet with a credit card or even NFC on a phone in the future, when you could just look at a machine and maybe through some sort of biometric communication between that person and that machine, it recognizes you. And that could be an iris scan, it could be a face scan, it could be your voice. I could just walk up to, I really do think that there's going to be a day in my lifetime where in that instance I could be anywhere in the world, and I can go up to a machine in my own language and say, I want a ticket from here to there. And it's not even going to ask me to do anything. It's just going to, in the background, automatically know, this is Robert Policano, and be able to access my payment method without me having to do anything.
And how does this connect to the home eventually? Smart cars and smart homes.
Yeah, I think that they're just going to be all different nodes on a network, in a sense, on our personal network. I think they're all going to be communicating. And, we're already, something else that we talk about with a lot of our customers is this idea of what we've dubbed cognitive arbitration. And it's basically the automotive assistant being able to recognize the most relevant third party assistant to fulfill an action. So, say I'm driving my car, and I get in and I say I want to open up the garage door opener. Now, the drag and drive platform might not necessarily be the software that's driving my garage door opener. Let's say that's on my Amazon smart home platform. But through cognitive arbitration and natural language understanding, it could understand that my intent is to open or close that garage door, and it can know, based upon my profile being linked to my other virtual assistant platforms in the background, it can then pass that request off to the Amazon smart home hub and give it the command to open the garage door and then fulfill it. And this is something that I think this concept is one that I think we're definitely moving toward, and I have no doubt that automotive manufacturers want to go to this, because they're about creating, unique brand experiences for themselves in their products. They don't want to cede that interaction to a tech company or some other third party. They want to create that. But, just like you have, human assistants. If I go to my CEO's assistant, or my CEO asks his assistant to get some information, she's going to then reach out to the other assistants, or he, within the organization, and get that. So he's dealing with his assistant, which you could think of as like the master assistant, and then that master assistant can speak with the other assistants and get that. And it's kind of analogous to sort of the architecture that automotive manufacturers are looking to create for their user experience. So you're dealing with the Mercedes assistant, or the Ford assistant, or the drag and drive assistant, and they're smart enough to understand what the user wants and to go and get that information and pull it back and fulfill that request.
Wasn't a different part of Nuance working on something like this for smart speakers in the home? I'm trying to remember that from last year.
Honestly, I don't want to say yay or nay, because I can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think Nuance it's a different group than yours, obviously. I know you guys are into a lot of things.
Yeah, that would probably be in the mobility division, so I probably shouldn't say, because I might not say the right thing.
Yeah. How did you end up at Nuance from Mercedes?
That's an interesting story. So as you saw in your research before we talked today, I spent the majority of my career so far working in various roles at Mercedes. And I was for the majority of that time, I was based here in northern New Jersey, where their U.S. headquarters had been since the 1960s. And people in the industry will know that about 30 years ago, they decided to relocate and build a new headquarters and campus down in the Atlanta area, Sandy Springs. And my roots are a little too deep here in New Jersey, and I decided to leave the organization. Without going into too many details, I was very excited to pursue entrepreneurship, something totally unrelated to technology or cars. And ultimately, after pursuing that for the better part of a year and a half, I realized that I just didn't have the capital to really be successful at that point in time. So I started looking at opportunities out there, and before too long, I learned about what Nuance was doing, and there was a terrific opportunity, and it just kind of seemed like a really natural fit for my background, and I was very excited to hear what Nuance was doing, and I was already familiar with Nuance through my old role at Mercedes, and here we are.
So isn't it kind of ironic you end up at Nuance and then Mercedes is your client?
It is funny, but it's not just Mercedes. It's like a lot of different car manufacturers. So I'm kind of enjoying, coming with the perspective of one particular manufacturer, which happens to be one of the the major innovators in the space, right? So, I kind of understand where they're coming from in that mentality, but it's been really rewarding for me to be looking more broadly across the manufacturer ecosystem there. I mean, Nuance has relationships with, I don't know, I think the statistics is somewhere in the low 80% of all manufacturers on the planet. And there's dozens of them in China alone. And I just find it's just really interesting because there's just so many different approaches and interesting things happening out there.
Last question. What do you see as the differences as this technology evolves in the automotive sector, differences you see around the world, if any?
That's a great question. Well, there's cultural differences. For example, and this is just random things that come to top of mind here, like in Japan, it's very common for people to have screens in their vehicles that they're using to watch video content, which is something, in Europe and North America is kind of verboten and not so common. So that creates opportunities, right? How do you create, a safer environment and interacting with that sort of thing? China is just on fire in terms of their ability to really turn concept into product. They're not afraid to put something out there and fail, which, again, this kind of speaks to, this is a nice, interesting contrast to sort of the way automotive in Europe and the US has always been. It's much more planned and cautionary. And this is something that I think one of those key things that the industry in general is grappling with is how do we get comfortable with being uncomfortable, but yet, in terms of innovating and being, first out there or second or a close follower there, because the tendency in the past has always been, no, it's got to be perfected before we can launch anything. But I think consumers' expectations are also evolving, just as in the era since the smartphone, just in the last 10 years or so, people are sort of more accepting of that things come out and they get better over time. There's a software update that's pushed and it gets better, and people are starting to understand that their car can get better over time too. It's not just a static object that sort of depreciates in terms of its usefulness or becomes obsolete necessarily like we're used to.
Great stuff. Thank you, Robert, and thank you all for listening to the Voices of the Internet of Things.
Thank you, Chuck.